Hello, I'm very glad to receive you here in our free course on global politics. Today, we're going to cover some of the themes we're working with in our Global Politics Academy. So we invite you to know a little bit more about the courses we offer, but also this piece, which is this free course, is also dedicated to give you a big picture of some of the main things that impact directly in our themes of work, which are derived from the scenario that KPMG had published recently, dedicated to the infrastructure industry. So we're going to focus on the 10 scenarios that they built and how those scenarios and themes impact in global politics. So also we are going later to talk a little bit more about the type of courses we offer so that you can, have this big picture of the themes we work with, but connected to the trends we are going to talk about today. So my expectation is that you enjoy and be in touch with us, especially with us in the coordination, academic coordination, which is in the email, which is coordinator@globalpolitics.academy. So let's begin talking about the report. So you may access the report, which is in PDF and also in link inside the platform. And right after, you can view the course, you can, view all the video and also access the PDF. You may be eligible to write your name and have your certificate downloaded to your machine automatically. So the first scenario that KPMG is working with is about uncertainty. So it is about, telling the industry, and especially the infrastructure industry, that they may face many challenges even in 2021. So 2021 will not be a year without fear of challenges like we were, experiencing during 2020. The first strain is dedicated to uncertainty, because uncertainty is not only a problem. So uncertainty in many industries after after COVID and the COVID, theme, those industries may be planning with more attentive to complexity. So it is true to say that uncertainty and complexity are part of the same, box, in which a scenario like this with, various levels and phones of uncertainty may create, adaptation in the institutional level that can deal better in the next phases with the trends associated to this complex scenario. So indeed, the infrastructure industry is really affected, but in many ways it is affected because it has to build itself in another pace, in another way to deal with complex scenarios, which involve governments, involve private sector, involve consumer relations, all of those very different from before. So it's about planning and how can one plan itself and plan inside your institution with the variables that indicate that not only the industry or their sector will leave the crisis better than before, but also for the next crisis or for the next cyclothemia, for the next challenge, they're going to be more adaptive. So adaptation is something not only connected to the challenge that we are facing all, but adaptation is something that we must create in nature. And it is there is the need to embed adaptation qualifications in our industries so that industries or sectors can deal with complexity. And of course, international affairs is about complexity. We all know as internationalists, we deal daily with complexity. Not always very practical people or very, sector-based professionals are aware of how complexity can build, can help building institutions and can help building governance, regulation, relations, so that the main focus of the industry or the sector can work fine. So it's all about the coincidence of that there are many more variables than we can see whenever we see a very specific sector in the industry. So those variables and all connected variables are about complexity. So if one in its strategical role may think just about the focus of the business, he or she want achieve the complex variable which is dedicated to many other features and conditions that are not connected to the main business. So if considering that uncertainty may be the first scenario published, the second trend would be about the cities. So let's consider we have governments, and all together they try to engage themselves in international organizations, in international regimes, in regional organizations, in sectorized organizations. But that doesn't mean that once governments and governors and authorities, engage in a discussion and they are okay with a resolution, they plan themselves to create kind of, common path. That doesn't mean that in the local level where people live, cities will be complying with all the measures that are being shaped and they are being, thought in the strategic level. So the second trend is about how cities will rethink their value proposition. But their rethinking in terms of value proposition has a very specific significance, which means cities are more enabled to participate in the political arena than before, I'm sure. But also cities have expectations. So when we think about expectations, we think about what are the paths, what are the ways cities are going to be engaged in the discussion and being aware that they need to participate, how they're going to deal with technology trends, with the regulation trends, political trends after pandemic, and how they can accelerate those processes and help these many engagements that are being set in the strategic level, in the macro level, how can they, in the micro level, how can they help, states and international organizations in general to accelerate the pace they are. So I'm sure that the post-COVID scenario brings us many challenges, and one of the most important challenges is about the way people are living, the way people are consuming, the way people are working. So people work and people decide to live either like nomads, digital nomads, or either like locally employed, in a traditional way. They all interfere in the local dimension. So if we thought about, if we may plan ourselves as like a society to the next, to the near future, we must think that the involvement, the individual involvement, and the compromises that are embedded are much more important than they were before, especially considering the differences in between the macro and the micro level. So let's consider also that digitalization interferes directly in the way cities are going to behave in this scene. So this second trend is also about creating efficiency and bringing, quality to the lives of people, bringing quality to the relations that affect city development, and bringing also many other things and spheres that were not considered by the local government. So it is true that if efficiency is guaranteed in a local, people and society may develop in a better pace. So it is also true that clusterization, which the report called central business districts, so all the efforts dedicated to the local enterprises or local developments, they are multiple and they are very important to the main project of the society for the post-COVID and especially for the post-COVID generation. So this trend also includes many other trends. So those associated to technology, to being a more green city, to digitalization, to citizen participation, and so on. But it means that it's very difficult to talk about all those trends without, perceiving the way cities are going to behave in the scene. The third trend is about the borders. So we're going to talk about 10 trends, but the border may be the most paradigmatic, because when we have a pandemic like COVID, one of the first measures is to, concretely to go, further and deeper in your own problems. So states become more nationalist. Regimes are going to be contested because flow of people and flow of money is interrupted either by the regulations that emerge or the necessity, the demands for interrupting the pandemic. So when we talk about borders, we talk about a very unique, problem, which is very much connected to the flow of people, of course, and at the very end, to the humans' right that affect populations that are in transit, but also the way governments will deal with their borders and how infrastructure will work within the government institutions to better achieve the principles and objectives and outcomes that are needed from the planning sector, from the strategic level. So borders are, a very contentious thing, but not only because of the pandemic, governments and local governments, local regime institutions or national institutions, federative institutions, they all had to work together to create, kind of, cooperative frameworks and to use the best knowledge they could. And knowledge is not only about an abstract, thing, but also knowledge is about infrastructure that can be used whenever the crisis emerge. So when we talk about borders, we talk about also the fourth trend, which is about infrastructure supply networks. And it is not, kind of, out of the box to say that those implications connected to the borders are also connected to the infrastructure involvement. So developments in many sectors are also part of the detection. Their infrastructure investments were needed before, and if they were not done in the right pace, there is the sense, the common sense that it's really difficult to create those assets, really important assets of the society and of the national governments in a very fast pace. So if the trend is connected to border security, we also have the necessity of creating ways to government controlling those flows of population, money, and products. But we also need to, understand the supply demands that networks of infrastructure demand. So we may talk about port security, we may talk about airport security, airport infrastructure, rail infrastructure, road infrastructure. So how those infrastructures or how those investments are posed as we are facing a crisis, and all technology, all structure may be needed to deal with the problems that are emerging and daily emerging. So the fourth trend is about the supply networks, and we may say that the fourth trend is also associated to the various links that were created during a crisis or during the pandemic crisis. So we must say that supply chain and all the managers that have to deal with this supply chain, they had to face, the need. They had to face, more importantly today than before, the need for connection. So connection is not only having at the right time the right suppliers. If you need more of something, to have a robust, network that can, offer you exit whenever your demand increases. So you may be flexible as an actor, as an institutional actor inside a crisis. You may be more available to transform itself and make your transport, logistics, supply chain, connections, international connections more effective. So one thing that emerges immediately is that no one survives alone. And supply chain is not only about the chain to govern production till the ending consumer. Supply chain is about creating a network, you know, a useful network that can transform itself whenever there is the strengthening of a crisis. So the trend five is about new finance flows into the market. So this may occur, more importantly, because of the pandemic, but it's not new. So in fact, there are many challenges associated to border control, and one of the most expressive challenges to globalization and to the amplification of commerce in the digital world, in the digital domain, is about the flow of money, the flows of money. Of course, it also emerges with the flows of money, various, needs in terms of security. Whenever we consider crime networks or criminal networks are evolving, they are very, much in a very important success in terms of, creating bridges that permit, those illegal networks prosper. But at the same time, there is the advancing in terms of the banking relations, in terms of the way people are going to face their jobs or their careers or their investments, their personal investments. They're flowing, during their lives, and there are, various ways to be connected to jobs, like live in a place, work for another, have your investments in another one. So what about the flows of money and how capital can, organize itself for the fit that people and societies need? And at the same time, fear is also part of the constitution of the states today. So even though we have the states as the main regulators, we also have fear, because we also have fear of war. We have many, ways to create instability to markets. So when we think about money flows, we think about how the investments flow, how crises affect investment flow, how those flows are behaving when we can compare flows that are connected to investments, real investments, and legal investments, and those flows and the interruption eventually of the legal investment flow, natural flow, because of the measures of security that are connected to crime, and to crime flows. So how governments would be more prepared to the crisis, or how they will face new crises in the future with a better structured, scene in terms of, dealing with money without bankrupting the economies, the local economies, and considering that most part of the economies are fragile. We are, considering that we are 170 or 80 countries, and very few of them have this structure to maintain themselves out of or beside the crisis like this. The sixth trend I am going to point, and again, it's this recourse is basically understanding the report that was launched by KPMG. The sixth trend affects everyone, even the smaller ones or the biggest ones, which is about going green. Going green is really, of course, is really affected by by people's consumer, but not only, because infrastructure is being called, infrastructure industry is being called to be very attentive to the various regulations and commerce and states and people and enterprises and companies, international or local companies, they are being, forced to transform themselves because market relations is also about being green. So there is the way companies are going to produce, the way they're going to be installed, the way they consume energy, the way they deal with international partners, the way their international partners behave, if they are local producers or if we consider the governments that are associated to those local partners. So there is a trend in terms of investments that are going, deeper and deeper to qualify the assets. So investors in general, they're looking very deep to the way they're going to invest, because the qualification of their investments is also dependent on the way the possible assets are dealing with the green movement. So there are two dimensions for the green objective or the green outcome, which is the first one is the climate change. The second one is about going green in terms of the way you consume or you produce or you deal with materials and so on. So this is about environment protection. And at the very end, how this non-environment protection is affecting climate change. So there are two main things that are connected and also affect industry and especially infrastructure industry, because we're talking about governments. So one cannot be a political science or internationalist, even though international affairs is not only for internationalists or political science or whatever, but one cannot consider the international affairs and how they affect your business without considering that we are talking about governments and how they organize themselves in between regulation and infrastructure. So there's no government without regulation, laws, for instance, instances or government instances that work to create laws and legislation that can create this big framework that organize society inside a border, inside a frontier, and also the infrastructure that guarantees that these regulations can be in place. So when we talk about infrastructure, we're not talking just about energy supply. We're not just talking about the way roads or rails or ports is, created or built or developed. But we are talking also about the way this infrastructure is working on behalf of the strategic planning of the state. So this infrastructure is about also the institutions, how they are built, how the careers are built, how democracy is protected, if it is a democracy, because we also deal with many governments which are, non-democracies, and they are in place in the international system and international commerce as important actors. But if so, infrastructure is also about the way government relations will happen at the very end. So how much, carbon heavy assets does the state have? What about the compensations? What about the commitments that this state has in terms of the other business it wants to promote, but are dependent of the way the government is dealing in the international sphere. So we can go to the seventh trend, because this is all about resilience. So when resilience jumps up in the agenda, which is the trend 7, we are talking about the way resilience is connected post-pandemic as an asset for surviving even in crisis. So crisis and crisis planning was much more about the sectors affected directly to emergencies. Imagine natural emergencies. So there were few sectors that were directly affected to natural disasters, and of course, they were more prepared to deal with a complex scenario like a crisis, like a common crisis, than others. But what this means? This means that society understood with the pandemic right now that many of our assets, and especially because we have the digital domain also, and this is different from the other pandemics that society had lived before. But because of this, resilience is part of any sort of planning as to maintain institutional design or institutional, main conditions in the long pace, in a long, term scenario. So let's talk about, resilience, talking about also funds, because when we talk about resilience, we talk about risk. And so how much risk is your company or is your sector, prepared to deal with? So what is the level of risk your industry or your institution deals daily? So when you think about the risks, you can maybe think about the conditions of resilience you may have. But the condition of resilience, of course, is dependent of money. So when we talk about resilience, we talk about also the need for assessment of funds that need to be in place, or that need to be, minimizing the threat that a crisis may provoke in a determined institution or government or scenario. So it is important to consider that there are the planning assets, and there are the funds that may be considered also for periods of non-production, non-commerce, closed borders, and so on. So what are the new expectations that derive from these resilience assets in each of the industries post-COVID scenario, in a post-COVID scenario? So the trend 8 will be about delivering us securely in a digital world. So if the digital world in international relations view is about a dimension, so a domain, so there is the digital domain. If we have the air and aerospace, the land domain and the seas domain, we also have the digital domain. And the digital domain becomes increasingly more important because of the way disruptive technologies can affect directly, not indirectly, directly the assets that are being built for, for decades. So if we are all connected, of course, one of the most important trends is about the role technology and internet, and also in this way, 5G and all the political discussions around 5G and building, trust relations that can guarantee that states still can trust themselves in each other, so that we can have a unique internet, because states discussing if they must also create their own domains of digitalization and separate. So how many discussions derive from that? So there is the connectivity, among peoples and among societies, how to interfere, to regulate, how to interfere in terms of controlling crime and abuse in this domain. How can infrastructure investment, absorb in the same pace, in the same, fast way it is being done in the digital world or digital domain. So delivering securely something, information, is challenging, is very challenging. And post-COVID, there's another thing that adds to the digitalization theme discussion, which is institutions had to be connected, more connected than before, because no one could afford to create an exit from the crisis without, a compound or a group of companies together looking for the vaccines, or a group of countries, working together to enhance border control, to enhance the flows of money, to enhance whatever. So in this way, interconnections or interagency efforts are much more important, but also dependent on information assets. So what about the flows of information? We know that we have much more information, open source information to access, but how can we achieve better analysis of the crisis, reaching out the qualified information we need, because we know it is too difficult to qualify information in the digital world, or to ask the digital world for qualified information. So there we have the fake news. There we have instruments that are failing in the controlling of various types of abuses. Abuses in elections, abuses from governments, abuses from groups that are organizing themselves out of the government's regulations. So it is central to the understanding of all those first trends, that no initiative will be, will succeed in its efforts if it does not consider the digital assets, the digital dilemmas, and the digital ethical purposes of its, presence in the world. Because there's no policy building, there's no asset building, there's no resource building without considering the norms, the ethical values, and all the valuables that are inside the digital world. The trend 9, or ninth trend, is about how government is organizing itself to transform. And it is interesting because doesn't matter if it's a democracy or if it's not. And it's a pity, but it's, I personally, make my own advocacy for democracies. But even the best democracies, the most efficient democracies, are struggling in transforming themselves. Because if there are very efficient institutions in place, even when they are in place, the best institutions fail in creating ways and instruments to transform regularly themselves. So not only having a contingency, an emergency plan, and creating ways to have resilience in the long pace, having a strategic balance that considers periods of pandemic, for instance, guarantees that the institutions are prepared to transform themselves without the crisis. Because if we had considered in the first trend that crisis may come also to provoke good transformations in peoples and institutions, we may also consider that governments would have to do it regularly without the presence of big crises. So, of course, we understand that there is cyclothymia in economic flows and, of course, in institutional and political flows. But those governments must also think about their regularity in terms of proposing themselves self-evaluation. So, in the emerging markets, of course, development banks had also been, creating new ways to pose investment and return, return from these investments. So we have, some structures derived from the end of the Second World War. These structures of financing were built in a way that were not guaranteeing development in most part of the countries. So there is the emergence of new ways to financing, to investment, to I could say also emerging economies posed themselves in a different way, so that not only very strong economies or very huge economies could suffer less from the crisis, but also the emerging economies could pose themselves as important actors in this scenario. But still, even with these new ways to do investment, to organize itself, to do in a different way it was before, so it was not sufficiently fast or sufficiently adaptive. So we have the main structures of governance and government that were, at this last 50, 70 years, that were considered the most strong, states and economies. They would be less affected by those crises, and of course, less affected by difficulties in their own transformation. But it's not true. Because they were robust, they also robustified their institutions. But at the same way, emerging economies, which were more adaptive in nature because they were emerging, they were also struggling with their own difficulties because their institutions were not robust, sufficiently robust. They couldn't afford to have the self-evaluation in their benefit. So self-evaluation is something to look very deeply, because governments will have to consider themselves as structures in movement. And as structures in movement, they will have to open their channels to understand how the society is moving, so as elected governments, so as industries, business, from all types. So one thing that the pandemic challenges, driven was that governments and institutions and various types of institutions, private or public, they were faced with the need to create, ways to self-transformation. And this is also about the 10th challenge. The 10th challenge is about how governments are working with their partners. So of course, partnership is about, creating ways and exits to diminish your vulnerability. So if governments are facing the challenges, they are more connected. They are, interdependencies were already there. But also interdependencies can be used in the benefit of institutions. So governments were already looking for partners, but they realized it with the pandemic that they could not do it without the private partners, the international partners, and without the common sense of interdependence. So how they're going to deal with this, it is dependent on the old regulations and how regulations are going to be adapted. So people in the various positions they're going to help their own governments from the local sphere to the federal sphere or to the regional sphere, to the international sphere. They're going to help their governments to create the solutions. But in some cases, and I would say most part of the cases, governments are not prepared to ask for help. The ways they are, built, the ways they are developing themselves are not, are not intuitive to engaging in society. So from this, I would say, in a more interconnected world, we must feel that these challenges are all to develop people's institutions, governments, and relations. We all came from an interdependent scene, but we are going for sure to a more interdependent one. If you would like to listen more about these trends and many of the things we could, touch a little bit here, stay tuned, track us. We're going in the next month, we're going to talk about the BRICS and the various types of inequalities. We're going to propose learning with some tools that permit comparison and how you can evaluate your own scene of inequality based on the comparison that we can offer you from BRICS countries, which are very different countries. We're also going to talk about defense economics and how defense economics and security economics interferes in the market in general, how states are positioned in the international system based on the way they plan their defense economics, even as consumers or producers. We're going to talk also about ways to engage practitioners in terms of decision-making processes. So we have two courses dedicated to this. One is the Model United Nations course dedicated to the apprehension, how one can use the Model United Nations to promote simulations in your institutions and create policy building based on simulations like this, interactive simulations, and listening to practitioners and to the various types of professionals in your institution, in our institution, as to provoke transformation in our institution. We're also going to offer a scenario analysis course in which one student will be able to look for some scenarios already built and how they can apply those scenarios to their own sector, to their own business. We're going to talk about governance, border security, migration. We're also going to talk about strategic thinking in terms of, defense, security, state planning. We're going to talk about Russia. We're going to talk about cases also. We're going to cover cases. We're going to talk about positive discrimination, talking about the cases from US and France. So our approach is very much dedicated to application, to the application of knowledge. We come with the conceptual frameworks. We come with the method, the various methods. We come with the themes and also go through cases as to promote and provoke application, so as you can absorb application in your sector based in other types of application. So we are launching the Global Politics Academy. We're very much, we're very much connected to the challenges we pose to ourselves in trying to reach what the public, what the students are looking for right now. In a global way, we are positioned in various countries. We are going to offer these courses to various types of people. So we are very motivated, and we are going to look, in detail to absorb, as long as you give us out inputs to absorb what are your needs, and so stay tuned to track us. We always give 4 months ahead the names of the courses. So the next month is also, we are going to offer you some news. So thank you again for the audience, and see you later. Bye-bye.